Hey, this is Amy, and we are going to be talking about the Neolithic Revolution and early agricultural societies today. That's what you guys read about for homework over the weekend, and I'm going to go through and kind of recap that reading to make sure that we're all on the same page. So, one of the first things that we need to talk about is how Paleolithic, so before the agricultural revolution, these hunter-gatherer societies that we talked about last time were primarily egalitarian. We talked about how these places, these people, because they were primarily hunters and gatherers, they moved from place to place seasonally throughout the year. And that because both men and women contributed equally to the food production within a group, or because everyone kind of had to have a responsibility and a job, that pretty much things within these societies are generally equal. This has been found to be true by most anthropologists and other people that study hunter-gatherer societies throughout the 20th and 21st century. So this is the idea that all people within a group are equal and have equal rights and opportunities. With the beginning of the agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic Revolution, depending on the terms that your teacher or your textbook use, we're going to see a shift away from these egalitarian societies, right? And one of the ways that individuals might not necessarily farm, but still maintain a mobile lifestyle is going to be by being pastoralists. These are groups of people that have gone through and domesticated wild animals, such as sheep or horses or cattle. They've domesticated these animals, they've made them tame, and then they move basically through different places throughout the year to ensure that their animals that they herd have enough to eat. And those animals are their primary form of kind of food. Now, pastoralist societies are interesting because some pastoralist societies are egalitarian, like many hunter-gatherer groups, but others practice something called patriarchy, which you guys read about. And patriarchy is a society in which the government or society in general looks to the oldest men of a family or a group. And you trace sort of power and position and property through that male line. And because everything is done through the male line, we actually see women excluded from power. Western societies like ours are patriarchal. I grew up with my father's last name, and I was sort of known as his child. Feminists often talk about patriarchy because, again, they are choosing leaders based on sort of gender rather than ability, right? There are societies that are called matriarchies in which power and position and property are passed through the female line, but those are less predominant. And they do happen. We'll talk about some societies like that, but most of the societies that we talk about in the world that are agricultural or pastoralist have a tendency to be patriarchal. Now, let's get to the chase, right? The main reason why we're here, the Neolithic Revolution. And the Neolithic Revolution, or sometimes it's called the Agricultural Revolution, is the first time in which human beings over the course of a couple thousand years figured out that, oh man, if I put these seeds in the ground, plants will come out. Why don't I put a bunch of seeds down and then we'll come back here next year and then there'll be plants. And over time, people started saying, well, maybe we should plant seeds, water them, and stay here and take care of them, right? And this is, again, a very long transition of time in which, again, people sort of figure out how seeds and germination and planting work and eventually decide to sort of stay where they've planted their stuff, right? Their crops. And this is the development of settled communities. And a lot of the societies that we talk about in this course are going to be agricultural. And one of the great conflicts within all of world's history is the clash between agriculturalists, right? And also pastoralists and other nomadic peoples. That's going to be a big conflict throughout the class. Now, once these early agricultural societies adopt farming, we're going to see an overall increase in population. And if you guys aren't familiar with rap, there's a song called More Money, More Problems. And you can learn a lot from rap. And the important part about more money, more problems is that it's really more of anything that causes more problems, right? When you have more people, you're going to see more conflict, an increase in disease, an increase in sort of like a need for supplies and space, right? And again, the jump in human population from 3000 BCE to 500 BCE is really quite extraordinary. You will also have an opportunity later on to read a critique of agriculturalism. There are some people that think that agriculture is actually a massive mistake because of all of the complexities and problems that come with living in a settled society. Now, agriculture wasn't invented by like one or two people and then sort of told everybody else. It is rather extraordinary because when you're looking at this map, you see that all around the world, relatively around the same time, human beings figured out how farming worked, how seeds and germination worked, and began to live in settled communities. And again, these communities started off very small from the original hunter-gatherer bands, in a band. According to my anthropology professor, and what was this, like 2003, she said a band was like 30 people or so. So I apologize if that's wrong. But you settle down with your group of people, you build a village, and then maybe you're really successful, right? And then other people come and they want to join you, and maybe you have more children because you have a more stable food supply. So men and women are more fertile, right? And your population grows. But here's the really big deal about farming. Farming requires imagination and planning. Just like when we talked about the cave art during the Paleolithic period, that, an individual first has to figure out what food or what seeds and plants can be grown, right? Like which crops they want. They have to domesticate these plants. Then they have to figure out how to water them, how to harvest them, what tools go into it. So there's all of these steps that are in the process of farming, right? Maybe you need to think about predators and protecting, if you've domesticated animals, about how to protect your horses or your cows. And, do you build a fence? Do you build a house and keep them inside? And farming really just illustrates how early humans have that behavioral modernity. This idea of thinking abstractly and in the future and imagining solutions to their problems in ways that are very novel and different. So, irrigation. Irrigation is going to be incredibly important for these agricultural societies. And one of the reasons why we see these agricultural societies grow so quickly over time is because you need water in order to grow your food, right? So how are you going to, on a large scale, irrigate your fields, right? So this is a beautiful photo of some rice fields in Japan, where you can see that they have terraced or dug into the side of a mountain, right, into a hill, and they have flooded these areas in order to grow rice, because rice requires an intense amount of water. And speaking of requiring lots of water, you'll find that the early civilizations that we are going to be talking about in Afro-Eurasia, the Nile River Valley, the ancient Egyptians in Africa, the Mesopotamians in the Middle East, in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. We'll be talking about the Indus River Valley civilizations and the Harappans. And in China, the people that settled along the Yellow River or the Shang River, right? Now, obviously, rivers are a great source for water, right? A river, it flows it's nearby. You know that there are going to be animals and plants and trees and all sorts of resources that you require. But rivers are also important because of annual flooding, right? In spring, when the snow melt comes down from the mountains and into the low-lying areas where most of these places are, these river valleys are going to see an influx of water. And when that water rushes in, it's also going to dredge up all of the silt and all of that sort of decayed matter that rests at the bottom of rivers. And all of that silt is going to come up. And as it floods, it's going to spread across all of the areas where people farm. And that's really good because that acts as kind of a natural fertilizer. So that's one of the many reasons why river valleys are so important for these early civilizations. The other part that's important besides the water and the silt is that if you live in these river valleys, in particular along the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Yellow River in China. These rivers have very erratic flood patterns. They either flood too much or flood too little. So in these places, we're going to see what I'm going to call complex institutions or governments develop very quickly because people need to band together in order to figure out how to control flooding and how to ensure that they get a regular amount of water into their fields for irrigation. So this is a satellite photo of Mesopotamia today. Someone even included the lines for countries, but those lines do not exist in real life. Anyway, and this is one of the earliest cities that was in Mesopotamia called Jericho. Now, if you look at Mesopotamia itself, and if you look at the Middle East, you'll know that until you get to the coastal areas or the regions around the Tigris and the Euphrates or other sources of water, you're dealing with a lot of desert. So if you are living in a place that is prosperous like Jericho, why would you want to build a wall around your city, right? So think about sort of the lack of natural sort of protections like mountains. This is fairly flat land, desert. And the people living in Jericho are going to have a lot of natural resources and other supplies, and it's going to be important to sort of protect that. So they add a wall around their city, right? And you can also tell that they have to have a great degree of coordination between all of their peoples. This is a reconstruction of what the city looked like around the year 7000 BCE. So this illustrates that they had to have some sort of government coordinating everyone together to get them to build, the walls, the houses, the irrigation, methods of irrigation. They're planting trees and fields. So it's kind of a way of, again, illustrating that these folks, despite the fact that they're living in the year, 7000 BCE, their lives are still remarkably similar to our lives in the 21st century. Human beings don't stop wanting water or space or protection. Also consider Katal Hayuk. I know I'm butchering that, so I apologize. I lost my Post-it where I had the pronunciation written down. But in this particular city, it's constantly occupied from 7250 to 5400 BCE. And remember that time goes down to the year 1, right? So think about how and why people could live in this place for so long and how they could have 5,000 to 8,000 residents. Here's a map so you can see Katal Hayuk and Jericho sort of within the Fertile Crescent of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And if you're going to sort of be in the same place for 2,000 years, right, you have to have enough food, water, resources. It has to be a fairly lucrative place. There has to be some sort of trade or something that would attract people. And as you look at the photo, you'll notice how archaeologists have unearthed a lot of these buildings. They've made reproductions here. And like Jericho, again, there's strong evidence of a government or some kind of organizing body that got people to work together to build walls and houses, irrigation, farming. There's evidence of what we'll call specialized labor that I'll explain in a minute. And they have all of the factors that are necessary to have that many people. They have enough food, they have enough water, they have enough safety precautions in line, right? So my kind of final thoughts about the importance of farming, to summarize all of my rambling, that pastoralism and agriculture are going to lead to more reliable food supplies, which increases your population. And when you increase your population, we're eventually going to see what is called the specialization of labor. That's going to be in which, as people expand into these large cities, folks are going to focus on whatever jobs they are best at, or whatever they can kind of get paid to do or get trained to do. And we'll talk more about that. But this is going to lead, in the case of Mesopotamia and in the Middle East, we're going to see the development of social classes. And we're also going to see technological innovations, right? You cannot build a city that can support 5,000 to 8,000 people without the development of brick making, of engineering, of pottery, figuring out how to store food and kind of set it aside. We've already talked about irrigation technology for farmers. So all of those things are necessary in order to kind of support and develop a city. And we see in both pastoralist and agrarian societies, and we'll talk more about this in the next video, about how these elites, as these populations get bigger, we're going to see leaders and other individuals begin to kind of take precedence over others and create a hierarchy within their society. So that's the big deal with farming. That's what farming does.